My name is Serena Holt. I am 31 years old. For 4 years of my marriage, my husband used one word to describe me more than any other. Not to my face, always. In the way cowards do it. To his friends over drinks, to his mother on the phone in the next room, to colleagues at dinner parties when he thought I was too far away to hear. The word was useless. As in, she just sits at home, she doesn't really contribute, she's not exactly driven. He said it with the comfortable ease of a man who had decided what his wife was and stopped looking any closer. What he never bothered to look at was my father. What my father had built. What my father had left. And what was waiting, very patiently, in a trust account with my name on it, for the day I decided I was done being underestimated. Before I tell you everything, take a second to like and subscribe and drop your country in the comments below. Now let me tell you the whole story. My father, Raymond Holt, was not a man who talked about money. He grew up with very little of it in a small town in rural Virginia, the son of a mechanic and a seamstress, and he carried that upbringing with him the way people carry the place they came from, quietly, in the way they move through the world. He studied engineering on a scholarship, worked for 20 years at a logistics firm, and then, in his mid-40s, started his own freight and supply chain consultancy out of a spare bedroom with one client and a second-hand laptop. By the time I was in high school, his firm had offices in 4 cities. By the time I graduated college, it was operating internationally. He never drove a flashy car. He never moved us into a larger house. He wore the same brand of watch he had worn since before the company existed. You would not know, meeting Raymond Holt at a school event or a neighborhood barbecue, that you were standing next to a man worth considerably more than his appearance suggested. That was intentional. My father believed, with complete conviction, that visible wealth corrupts character, both in the person who has it and in the people who want to be near it. He raised me and my younger brother Theo accordingly. We had what we needed. We were not indulged. We were taught to work, to save, and above all, to keep our own counsel about what we had. The right people, he used to say, will love you before they know what you own. The wrong ones will only love you after. I was 24 when I met Daniel Marsh at a mutual friend's birthday dinner. He was 30, an account manager at a mid-size advertising firm, handsome in a groomed, deliberate way, with the kind of social confidence that comes from always being the most presentable person in a room. He ordered wine for the table without asking anyone's preference, and somehow made it feel like a gesture rather than an imposition. I found him compelling. I was not the only one. We dated for a year. He was attentive, funny, the type of man who remembered the small things. The name of my favorite coffee order, the anniversary of my mother's passing, the professor I'd mentioned once who had changed how I thought about literature. I brought him home to meet my father on a Sunday in October. My father shook his hand, asked him 3 questions about his work, and then said very little for the rest of the afternoon. On the drive home, my father called me and said, simply, "He's looking for something, Serena. Make sure you know what it is before you decide anything." I told him he was being protective. He said, "I'm being accurate." I did not listen. I loved Daniel. Or I loved who I believed Daniel was, which for a long time felt like the same thing. We married the following spring. 120 guests. Daniel's firm colleagues, his large extended family, my smaller but close circle of people. My father gave a toast that was warm and careful and said nothing untrue. Theo cried. My mother's photograph sat on a table by the door, framed in white. It was a beautiful day. I wish I had known how much of what was beautiful about it had nothing to do with Daniel. The first year of our marriage was fine. The second began to develop edges. Daniel's career had stalled in a way that made him restless, and restless people look for things to blame. I had left my job at a publishing house to finish a graduate degree in library science, which meant I was not bringing in income during that period, which gave Daniel something to point at when the restlessness needed a direction. It started as jokes. The student life must be nice. Some of us have to work. Said with a smile, always. Said in front of people, always. I corrected him the first few times, explained that graduate school is work, that it would translate into a career, that this was a temporary arrangement we had agreed on. He would nod and say of course, and the next social gathering the jokes would resurface, slightly sharper. By year 3, the jokes had stopped being jokes. I heard him on the phone to his friend Marcus one evening, standing in the kitchen while I sat reading in the next room. She doesn't do much, man. I mean, she never finished the degree, she's not working. I basically carry everything. I sat very still. I had, in fact, finished the degree. I had also quietly been offered a position at a university library that I had not yet accepted because Daniel had asked me to wait until we'd figured out whether we were moving cities for his potential new role. I had put my own trajectory on hold. I was sitting in the next room while he told his friend I didn't do much. I did not confront him that night. I made a decision instead. A quiet one. The kind my father would have recognized. I called Gerald Oates, my father's longtime attorney, a precise and unflappable man who had managed our family's affairs for 15 years, and I asked him to walk me through the terms of the trust my father had established in my name when I was 19. I had always known the trust existed. My father had told both me and Theo about our trusts on our 19th birthdays, sitting us down separately at the kitchen table with cups of tea and the kind of calm seriousness he brought to things that mattered. He told us the amounts. He told us the conditions. He told us the trusts were ours when we were ready, and that ready was something only we could decide. Not when you're 25, he had said. Not when you get married. Not on any schedule I set. When you feel certain about what you want to build with it, and certain that the people around you deserve to know it exists. That is when you use it. I had never told Daniel about the trust. Not because I was hiding it. Because I had never felt certain. Not of what I wanted to build. And not, if I was being honest with myself at 3 in the morning when honesty is unavoidable, of whether Daniel deserved to know. My father passed away 18 months into my marriage, a sudden cardiac event, the kind that gives no warning and no time. He was 63. I did not recover from it quickly. Daniel attended the funeral with the correct expression and said the correct things and then, within 2 weeks, was back to the subtle erosion as if a period of respectful pause was all that was owed. The restlessness had actually increased. My father's passing had revealed, I think, that there was no powerful man in my life whose opinion of Daniel needed managing anymore. The last external check had been removed. Within 6 months of my father's death, useless had become the word. Not always spoken. Sometimes it was the sigh when I mentioned a plan. The dismissive half-attention when I spoke at his colleagues' dinners. The way he would correct me mid-sentence in front of people. That gentle firm redirect that looks like helpfulness and is something else entirely. I lasted another year after that. The night that ended it was a dinner party at the home of Daniel's colleague Preston and his wife Gail. 12 people around a long table, good wine. The kind of evening where everyone is performing a slightly elevated version of themselves. The conversation had turned to careers, to ambitions, to what people were building. Daniel was expansive and warm, talking about a new client his firm had just landed. I said something. I no longer remember the exact content, something about the library position I had been reconsidering, a research initiative I had been developing. And Daniel turned to me with that smile, the one I had learned to read like weather, and said, "Serena is still figuring it out. She's not really a career person, she's more of a," he paused, performing a search for the generous word, "a homebody." Gail, across the table, looked at me with an expression of pure, helpless sympathy. I set down my fork. "Actually," I said, and something in my voice made the conversation still, "I've accepted the head of acquisitions position at Caldwell University Library. I start in 6 weeks. Daniel looked at me. "You didn't tell me that." "I'm telling you now," I said pleasantly. He recovered quickly, smiled for the table, said something gracious. But his jaw had done a thing I recognized. A slight tightening, the thing that happened when something had occurred outside his control. I watched it happen and felt, for the first time in a long time, entirely clear. I called Gerald the next morning. Not about the job. About the trust. It was time. Gerald and I met in his office 3 days later. He laid out the current state of the trust with the same quiet precision my father had always operated with. The consultancy had been sold 2 years before my father's death, in a transaction that had not been publicized, to an international logistics group. My father had been thorough and patient in how he structured both Theo's trust and mine. The number Gerald wrote on the notepad and slid across the desk to me was not a number I had fully internalized since my 19th birthday, because at 19 it had seemed unreal, abstract, a figure with too many digits to anchor to anything in my actual life. Sitting across from Gerald at 31, after 4 years of being called useless, it landed differently. I looked at it for a moment. Then I looked up at Gerald. "I'd like to begin the process," I said. Gerald nodded. He had been waiting, I think, for this appointment for some time. I did not tell Daniel that evening, or the next day. I retained a family law attorney named Patricia Drummond, who came recommended by Gail, who had texted me the morning after the dinner party with 3 words, "I know someone." Patricia was direct, thorough, and had handled enough high-asset divorces to know exactly how to structure what came next. She told me 2 things in our first meeting that I wrote down. The first, in this state, assets held in a trust established before the marriage and never commingled with marital funds remain separate property. Your husband has no claim to them. The second, the sooner we move, the cleaner this is. I filed for divorce on a Thursday morning. Patricia's office handled the service of papers. I had already quietly moved the things that mattered most to me. My mother's photographs, my father's watch, the first edition books from my graduate research, to Theo's apartment the weekend prior. Daniel received the papers at his office. He called me 7 times in the hour that followed. I let them go to voicemail. The messages moved through stages with a speed that would have been fascinating if it hadn't been so predictable. Confusion, then the gentleness of a man who thinks tenderness is a negotiating tactic, then the tight-voiced reasonableness of someone recalculating, then, in the 5th message, the first mention of what I had suspected was always somewhere underneath everything. "I know you have money from your dad, Serena. I know there's something there. We should talk about this like adults. What's mine is yours, you know that. We built this together. What's mine is yours. We built this together." From the man who had, 11 days earlier, described me as not really a career person in front of 12 people. I did not return the calls. Patricia did. Daniel's attorney contacted Patricia's office within 48 hours. There were, as Patricia had predicted, preliminary inquiries about the trust. There were words like marital partnership and contribution to household stability and reasonable expectation. Patricia answered each one with the documentation Gerald had prepared, the trust's establishment date, the ironclad premarital designation, the complete absence of any commingling. Each inquiry dissolved. The divorce was finalized 4 months later. Daniel received what he was legally entitled to from our marital assets, which amounted to a fair division of what we had built together. The furniture, the joint account, the equity in the apartment we had shared. Nothing more. Nothing from my father's trust. Nothing from the consultancy. Nothing from the life Raymond Holt had built in his spare bedroom with 1 client and a second-hand laptop while wearing the same modest watch he'd always worn. I started the position at Caldwell University Library on a Monday in March. Head of Acquisitions. My own office. My own team. A research initiative I had been developing quietly for 2 years, now with the institutional backing and the personal funding to make it real. I thought about my father constantly in those first weeks. About the Sunday afternoon he had shaken Daniel's hand and said almost nothing. About the kitchen table conversation when I was 19, the cups of tea, the calm seriousness. About what he had said when he told me the trust existed. The right people will love you before they know what you own. Daniel had loved, or performed love, in the presence of what he thought was a woman without much to offer. The moment her value became visible, the machinery of who he really was started moving. My father had known. Not specifically. Not prophetically. Just accurately, in the way that certain people understand human nature the way others understand weather. Not perfectly, but well enough to prepare. On a Saturday in April, I drove to the cemetery where my father is buried. I sat for a while in the quiet. I told him about the job, about the trust, about Patricia Drummond, who had been exactly as precise as he would have approved of. I told him that Theo was doing well. I told him I had finally felt certain. I did not tell him about the voicemails. There was no need. He would have heard the fifth one and recognized it immediately. The sound of a man who had spent 4 years deciding what his wife was worth, finally discovering he had been wrong about the number. I drove home with the windows down. Spring in the city, the good kind, all green and forward motion. I thought about the trust, about what I wanted to build with it. I had some ideas. Clear ones. The kind that come from finally being still enough to hear yourself think. My father would have smiled. Not a large smile. He was never a large gesture man. Just the small, private one he kept for things that had gone the way he intended. I know that smile. I learned it from him. I think I was wearing it the whole drive home.